Good afternoon. I'm sorry I can't be there. I hope not to bore you too much with this video, so I'll try to keep it as short as possible. First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Arbo for having organized this one-day symposium on Fausto Romitelli, a composer who sadly is starting to deserve a consideration into perspective, even if we all think it should have been too early for this. I will talk about Romitelli's Nell'alto dei giorni, immobili, a work that is dated 1990, and its score for flute, also piccolo and alto, B-flat clarinet, also bass clarinet, piano, violin, viola, and cello. As this presentation is focused on the living and sonorous aspect of the work, it's important to mention the source of the analysis, namely the recording of Romitelli's work by the American Thalia Ensemble, as included in their 2012 album Anamorphoses. In this short video, I just have the time to show some conclusions of the analysis, mainly drawn from just listening over and over to the recording, while taking advantage of the possibilities of skipping and fragmenting that a music player software supports. First of all, aesthetic analysis. You all know that the term is coming from Jean Molineau's semiotics of music as the word that identifies the interpretance of the listener as opposed to the composer and to the materiality of the score, and that its epistemological value have been questioned by Nattier, who in fact turned himself, in dealing with specific music works, to the analysis of the neutral level. On the other side, François de Lalande tried to overcome the experimental problems related to the individuality of references by turning to intentionality in order to ground the analysis of listening on the psychological concept of strategical behavior or conduite. In this way, he was able to detect a number of listening behaviors such as the empathic one, the figurative one, and the taxonomical one, a strategy based on segmenting the work, so to speak, on the fly while listening to it. Stéphane Roy is pointing the attention to the similarities between the taxonomic strategy and the gestaltist or morphological one. This last one is a strategy first proposed by Pierre Schaeffer, according which a segmentation by listening may take advantage of the possibility to repeat on and on the listening session of the work in whole or in fragments at will, what Schaeffer calls reduced listening. According to Roy, gestaltist listening has the potentiality to found an epistemological value of analysis by linking the units discovered while listening to the sounding neutral level. But, de Lalande says, reduced listening as a special and unusual way of listening is not able to account for listening as a social practice and to point to proper relevances. The problem seems to be connected to the idea of unit itself, or better, of sound object, as is used by both Schaeffer and de Lalande, a concept coming from a domain of description that relies more on sensory-motor and visual perception and is directed to the materiality of the word than on acoustical perception, which is oriented to a fluid world where boundaries or spatial dimension cannot be taken for granted. That's why this analysis is focused on distinguishing and recognizing, two very basic cognitive processes that emerge from the detection of changes in sound qualities and may determine a structure of distinctions and patterns. Of course, an analysis by listening is always temporary, as it may get deeper as the number of listening sessions increase, but the relevance of the chosen sound characters in which distinction and pattern can be found is still into play as the criterion to determine the quality of the analysis, as it happens for other kinds of analysis as well. But I think that this kind of, let's still call it gestaltist analysis, holds the epistemological status of a neutral level analysis and reinforces it by declaring the set of sound character that drive distinction and recognitions. For example, let's take an excerpt from bar 21 to bar 33. These bars are delimited by two strong discontinuities in dynamics. The first one being very uncommon in the work, as the sound emerges abruptly from silence with a slap tongue played by the flute. The second one, between a pretty loud chord and a sort of reverberation-like chord, while being much more common than the former, is also very strong. The duration of the performance of this section is about 16 seconds. Let's listen to it. In this figure, we can see the discontinuities I could detect by listening, with a reference to their possible source in the score. I just avoided discontinuities that are too soft to be considered as relevant, or with an inter-onset interval shorter than 100 milliseconds, such as in tremolos. These are in fact accounted more as a sound quality than as a rhythmical figure. Some distinctions are marked in white, as they couldn't be connected to distinctions in the score, and they are most probably artifacts resulting from the complex instrumental writing, such as inharmonic tremolos and so on. While these, so to speak, neglected discontinuities are still important in shaping the listening experience, it is paramount for the analysis to connect listening detections to the neutral level of the score, in order to reinforce the epistemological status of the analysis on one side, and, as we will see, to define the work's dialectics between score notation and performance. So, for now, these wide discontinuities mostly won't be considered in the analysis, even if within the turbulent section marked with the dashed over they can be pretty strong. Let's listen again to this section. These distinctions are mostly based on discontinuities in three sound characters: dynamics as a continuum between silence and the loudest sound, movement as a continuum between being still and being the most turbulent as possible, and pitch range as the continuum between just one tone and a white noise cluster. A discontinuity in one sound character may result from a sudden change in an estimated value of the character, or, in case of continuous change, in the direction of change. Here is the graphic showing how distinctions are related to these three sound qualities. These characters or qualities, or better dimensions, are far from being objective measurements, as they are the result of evaluation by listening to this section over and over. They rather serve the purpose to express the intuition of the listener on his experience and to stimulate the intuition and, of course, the criticism of the researcher. Moreover, they are certainly not the only dimension involved in my experience of listening to this section. As we will see, also timbre detection was very important, but they are what I've considered as most relevant in defining a common ground for changes in listening qualia, so that in the end they can account for a perceptive structure of the section. In fact, we can try to organize the discontinuities in a hierarchy according to the number of dimensions involved and to the degree of changes. This is not an easy task, as some distinctions are more comparable than others. Moreover, in this particular section, something apparently strange happens besides the already confusing part included in the dashed oval. From 1 minute and 7 seconds on, some distinctions that shouldn't be there according to the score appear as the viola chord is already there while the turbulent movement is still going on. In the score, that chord appears as a static presence only when all the other instruments are also still, while in the seconds before the chord should be played with fast tremolo. I don't know if this can be ascribed to an imprecise performance, but this can be confusing when comparing distinctions. For this example, I decided to accept this unexpected sound result as a part of the work. Anyway, I show this main hierarchical distinction with vertical lines crossing the graph. The thicker the line, the more important the distinction. Now we can organize the hierarchies in a graph. This apparently weird graph is actually a sort of distorted stylized version of the usual tree graph that was set up to follow a timeline so that it's easy to see the onset time of a unit in any level of the hierarchy. When comparing this section to what follows, we can immediately recognize the repetition of some elements that become actual components of a pattern. To show this, I used a very different kind of graph. Here is our section. The vertical line is the strong attack in the beginning, but in general the thickness of lines and shapes shows intensity and pitch range. Zigzag lines are turbulent moments, while shapes are static chords even if overlapped to zigzag lines. Dashed vertical lines are actual signals, single notes that emerge from the sound flow and may be lain within its range, as with the first one without letter, or isolate themselves in the lowest register as with cello, letter C, and with piano, letter P. They are the most recurrent elements of the work, something like a one-note figure that ground the development of the sound continuum to its foundation, or better, fundamental tone. The curved line represents a simple glissato element. The thicker line in the end is a string static chord, this time in the position showed in the score. When we listen to what follows, we can find something very similar. I just skipped the analysis of pattern repetition, leaving it to the intuition of listening. Here is the whole part with 3 repetitions of the pattern along the bars 21 to 74 of the score. In the fragment we have just listened, the pattern is present 3 times. But along the whole work we can recognize a number of patterns like this. In this graph, with the analyzed section in relief, all lowest level groping is done according to a common pattern, while only in the units from bar 166 to 185 is not easy to recognize an explicitly repeated pattern and are grouped following a different criterion. At this point, I need to come to a conclusion. Maybe the most striking aspect of this work is the dialectic it exhibits between flux and structure, the former emerging from the continuum of sound transformation in a blurring gestaltic texture, and the latter fragmenting the sound surface in crossing references by the recognition of resemblances. We can see this dialectic at all levels, such as in the opposition between envelopes and signals, or better between metamorphic turbulent textures and well-recognizable events, such as single notes with a sharp attack. But at a higher level too, we find the continuity with which the climax chord rise in the first part of the work up to the master climax chord in bar 132, followed by an attempt at a descent in the first following section from bar 161. From the structural side, there seems to be a general tendency in discovering that both envelopes and signals are patterns, only they belong to different time levels. And this is the premise to the immersion of all kinds of temporary structures between the faster signal level and the slower section pattern level. This process will bring us to the final section in which the pattern first presented in bar 245 and then repeated and varied in bars 297 and finally in bar 350 is already structured in pattern levels, so that, for example, its first component from bar 245 to bar 254 is already made by 3 presentations of a single pattern, originally lasting 4 measures and a half. So, the dialectic between flux and structure is also dramatically realized as a transformation from flux passing through a short blurred zone between bars 166 and 185 to structure, with an increment of the pattern levels. But it would be totally wrong to think to Nell'alto dei giorni immobili as a work built on a narration. Every passage of this dialectics is hidden. All we have is clues, very clear sometimes, but mostly in disguise, often contradicted, such as with the major discontinuities expressed by waved lines. For example, the 2-second silence that separates two sections in bar 188 with a strong discontinuity is compensated by a quasi-chromatic descending connection between the climax chord of the two sections in a way that suggests continuity. In the end, despite the tension between spectralist thinking on one side, as it is explicitly stated in the foreword of the score, with its idea of sound continuum, and a more traditional way to build form from pattern structure such as repeated cells, phrase organization, and so on the other side, this work seems to find a third way in a chaotic and yet static world. The constant logi takes care of that, where form is constantly struggling against the flowing matter in order to emerge and to build temporary shapes that are destined to be absorbed again in the ever-changing flux, like the ocean of Solaris that was described by Stanislav Lem and later by Tarkovsky in a novel that Romitelli would have surely appreciated. Thank you.